Hello everybody and welcome back to the Architecture channel with your host Eamon McCormick. Today I'm just going to summarize what we've been going over the last few sessions, which is talking about the different types of architectural services. The primary way we define architecture services is basically by defining strategic architecture services that are focused mainly on corporate and CEO level concerns. Segment architecture services, which are primarily focused on programs and large strategic initiatives, and then solution architectures, which are mainly focused on projects. We also often break out governance as a service because each of those three other services need to be governed, and we tend to recommend that you look at governance as a service that transcends the other three types of architectural services. This isn't the typical way a lot of people organize their architecture services because many people feel that they should focus on web services or big data. And what we're basically saying is that really when you look at how architecture is deployed within the enterprise, it makes more sense to organize primarily around programs, strategic and projects, because that's typically the way architecture is handled in most enterprises, whether they be governmental, NGOs or corporations. And this is kind of summarized again in this picture, which is an enhancement on what we have in the open group, which just shows that you've got that there's a relationship between these three types of architectures, because solution and project architecture relies on the segment program architecture for inputs and also for feedback, and then the strategic architecture as well is related to the program. So it kind of cascades down from the strategic down to the program down to the project. And as you can see, this relates to differing timelines and depths of detail, with the project being operating at a smaller detail, but there's usually a portfolio of projects operating within programs operating within the strategic. And within most large enterprises, you'll typically have maybe 100 projects in any one year that roll up to maybe 10 to 15 key programs, and then hence up to the strategic level. And it's managing this complexity is one of the reasons you really want to break out your architectures into these kinds of layers. So what's the real value then of doing all of this? Well, primarily the focus of the strategic architecture is to link strategy to capability building. Most people are now viewing strategy as tightly related to capabilities, aka you can't implement the strategy without having the appropriate capabilities. And then you take those capability building exercises and you link it to your programs, i.e. your portfolio of really mission critical plans that need to be implemented. And architecture though can be used for future strategic reasoning, as it helps you think through some of the major impacts of your strategies. But in our experience, most of the time it's used to link to strategies. You can use simulation, of course, to figure out whether your strategies make sense and what the impact of the enterprise is, which is great. But most of our clients, we've seen them usually mainly using architecture to translate architecture, not so much to develop optimal strategies. The programs are focused on usually realizing the capabilities that are related to the strategic goals and objectives. And there again, it's all about efficiency and effectiveness and the ability to translate strategic plans into operational points on the board. And then at the project, we're really down at the IT and the business capability layer, where we're reduced on looking at reducing program risks, making sure we've got good, healthy procurement, which is faster and cheaper, and we want to make sure that we get execution aligned with our program and strategic goals. So when you kind of look at that, then what you end up having is you have from an enterprise modeling perspective, an architect will basically usually look at a single strategic model for the enterprise, break it down into subsegments of models to relate to different aspects of the business, typically aligned to major chunks of the supply chain, and then we also have the solutions at the bottom. So what you can think of then is that your architecture is going to consist of a bunch of models, and each of those models are related. And it's been stated that architecture really is modeling, and you use these models to drive the projects and make sure you have the right scope, make sure they're doing the right things, make sure they interact with their environment correctly, and make sure you have the proper governance and coordination. So what does that really mean in terms of a typical enterprise? So you'll have a segment, you'll have your strategic model for the enterprise, and in a energy industry, for example, you'll have an operations model that will typically include generation, transmission, distribution, and then you'll have an asset model which talks to all of your asset management and your CMS type issues. Then you'll have commercial model which talks about billing and customer relationship management and products and services. And then your corporate model which talks about finance, HR, legal and IT. That would be corporate IT, or the business of IT, if you will. So as you can see, what this picture really shows is that the previous model breaks down to, in the real world, will look like you'll have a few different models. And then what you have is you've got your programs coming in. So you'll have programs typically aligned with operations, asset management, commercial and corporate. Typically your programs will land in one of those green buckets, and then you'll have all of your projects lining up underneath that. So what does that actually look like in terms of an actual implementation? Well, it's going to end up looking a little bit like this. So you're going to have your strategic layer, which actually is focused on different types of objects. And then you're going to have, so let's just talk about that just for a little, and we'll get into a little bit more of this in our next section when we talk more about strategic architecture. But what is in strategic architecture? We want to know what the strategic objectives are, what the enterprise strategies are, and strategies are things like, how are we going to win in the marketplace? So for example, we're going to invest a lot more in renewables. That would be an example of enterprise strategies. Or we're going to do a lot of grid scale batteries, enterprise strategies. Then you've got strategic outcomes, which are the points on the board you're looking to try and get to, which are goals and objectives essentially, and metrics. How do those then relate to strategic capability enhancements that have to come into place? So for example, in the case of DER, we got to get good at managing and building DER, distributed energy resources. And then you've got to look at what are your risks, what are the strategic programs you require, and what your capabilities need to be in terms of the value stream. So that kind of gives you strategic architecture, which is always focused on the big picture of what are my big strategies, what are my key strategic capability enhancements, and how do these put points on the board. At the next level down, when you look at the segment level, you're really now operating at the program level, and you're looking at objectives. Segment objectives and segment outcomes should relate back up to the strategic. And then you take the strategic capability enhancements and you break them down into smaller sets of sub-capabilities within the individual higher level segments. So for example, you would be thinking in DER about what would the renewables mean for generation, what would it mean for transmission, what would it mean for commercial, for example, as sub capability enhancements. Most importantly, you start looking at the next level down in terms of functions, services, actors, and requirements. And then at the solution level, we're down to the solution use cases, the services, the business actors, the application services, the capability enhancements, and the outcomes at the individual project level. So we're going to get into all of this a little bit later in future segments, but I think this gives you hopefully a good overview of how we see breaking down architecture between the different types of services, and future talks will discuss in detail each of these in turn so that you get a better feel for what exactly each of these are. Thanks so much for listening in, and look forward to seeing you soon.